and welcome back to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, How America Culture Came to Be, the podcast of the Frontier Culture Museum of Virginia. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel. Today we have our historic architecture specialist with us, Ray Wright. We'll be discussing the architecture found at the museum and its context, and also the development of a particular type of Valley of Virginia architecture.
Today is a beautiful day. We are outside. We are sitting right near our 1760 log cabin home, which is a reconstruction. And Ray, first off, why don't you give us a little background on how you got involved in historic architecture?
Well, prior to coming to work at the museum, I was a construction supervisor, but I haven't had at that point a degree in history. I was endorsed to teach social studies. I hadn't gotten my certificate yet, and I was looking for a job in the field. So I answered an ad to come to work at the museum, and it became pretty apparent to the museum that they needed my construction skills on some of the vast buildings we were doing at the time. So I pretty much segued from interpreter and interpreter supervisor into historic buildings.
And to follow up, you liked it so much, you then went and got an advanced degree in this. Isn't that correct?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that was probably one of the best things that I've done. I really like to be an expert at what I do, so I would try to garner as much education as possible for myself. Even now, I still apply it almost every day to something that I do here at the museum. So yes, I have a degree in historic preservation.
Let's start down the line of the people we talk about at the Frontier Culture Museum. Ray, can you describe the 18th century West African farm and the added complications that exhibit provide architecturally?
Well, when we talk about vernacular architecture, basically I'll just lift that definition up to say that it's a cultural building by the people based on their environment, using materials from their environment. And that pretty much sums up that particular site. The Igbo, when they build their compound, they're pulling strictly from the rainforest for materials. That would include, of course, mud, or aja, as the Igbo call it, for their building. They rely heavily on the raffia palm. They rely heavily on the oil palm for building these buildings. And unlike a lot of West African and African architecture, vernacular architecture that we're used to seeing, those mud structures were not built out of brick. It was built out of wet clay. And essentially, those houses are a pile of wet mud in the shape of a house allowed to dry out.
And they do have an advantage in incredibly hot and humid weather. What is that?
Well, first of all, the walls themselves are pretty thick. And then the roofs, and these are gable buildings, I should point out. The roofs have eaves that really spread out well over the fronts of the houses, so you actually have to duck to get in there. So most of the house is in the shade most of the time as far as the comfort of the building is concerned. You get a little bit of heat on the gables, and often I have to answer the question, well, were people so much shorter back then that they had to duck into these houses? No, not at all. Those were designed to, in a vernacular sense, to keep people as cool as possible. When I was in Nigeria, one building that we went into, it was actually a temple. The roof came down so close to the ground and hid the walls that we had to get on our hands and knees and climb into it to get into the building.
Can you speak to some of the research that went into doing this kind of experimental archaeology?
Well, the most useful thing was actually the field work when we went to Nigeria, and that was just taking lots of pictures, paying particular attention to construction techniques. I myself have a pretty good collection of the types of architecture that we ran into. They're almost always mud walls. Some of them were square with sort of hip roofs. Most, however, were rectangular in shape as well. So we paid particular attention to that, what seemed to be the most common there, and where they was located, too, within Igbo land. So we took special note of that. Then there was, as far as research was concerned, just a lot of study and a lot of books. And one of my favorite things to look at was Damahaski's Architecture of Southeast Nigeria. that gave us pretty much the rules that we had to follow when we constructed the compound. And the compound is based on an existing compound, or at least it was existing in 2006, on an existing compound in Southeast Nigeria, in Igbo land right now. And we were really wanted to get the spatial arrangements of all the buildings pretty much correct as well.
I will add that when that site was first finished, it looked absolutely stunning, but we ran into some complications which had nothing to do with the structures and everything to do with the climate. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, it's how should I put this? It's difficult to take a tropical building system and transplant it into a temperate climate. What worked extremely well in the rainforest of West Africa didn't work so well in the temperate Shenandoah Valley. The big challenge was basically freeze and fall. These buildings would absorb moisture, and during the winter months, this moisture would freeze, and it would just sort of fall off and flake off, and eventually weaken the buildings.
So of all the buildings we built, sadly, only one is left.
Yep, so far, only one is left.
But the goal of the museum is to rebuild the site in such a way that the buildings don't fall apart.
That's the goal, yes.
So we get a lot of visitors that refer to these structures as huts, but you refer to them mostly as houses. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I refer to them mostly as houses myself. Often some of the Igbo actually refer to them as a hut. But I don't like to call it a hut because in the Western world, it's a different connotation, which to some of our visitors might make it seem a little more primitive, a little more backward. So when I interpret that site, I rarely call them a hut, almost never call them a hut. I call it a house, the first wives' house, or the obi. I will give it its proper Igbo name, but I will never call it a hut. And that is just my interpretive response.
Was there anything else you wanted to add about the African site and how we built it, or anything along those lines?
Well, our first go-round at it was actually interpretively was splendid. We hired, for those 2 summers, 2009, 2010, we hired about 20 college and high school kids, and their minimum wage job was to mix mud with their feet. So our existing building, the last one, still is constructed of mud that is oozed up between someone's toes. The visitors love seeing us construct these buildings in traditional fashion. So that was, quite frankly, some of the best interpretation that we've ever done on that site. And that just led us into other areas that we could talk about, as well. So, yeah, my favorite thing was actually the construction of the original exhibit.
So in a change of pace, the 17th century English farm is a little more documented. Can you talk about the design and history of the English house?
Well, the design of the English house, as I interpret it, or as I understand it, is we're really looking at how people of that particular yeoman class, and you have to be very careful here when we talk about the use of space, but they use the space kind of differently than perhaps maybe their servants' housing would use the space. So you have a hall, and that hall is family room, it's cooking room, and it's work room. You have the parlor, which is on, I won't call it, sort of there on the front of the house, and its use of space is a little more formal. And the parlor actually showcases the wealth of the family that's living there. And I use the word wealth carefully there. They were not wealthy in a lot of respects, but they were doing very well, could afford better things. So the parlor showcases that. Then in the buttery, in the back, the good thing about that particular room is it shows how diverse their farming was. Everything that they're working on, everything that they're doing, what they're storing back in there. So it gives us clues as to the rest of the farming operation there in Hartlebury.
On the English farm, some people call it Tudor-style housing, some people call it half-timber and housing, some people just call it timber-framed housing. What is the correct term for that style of house?
Half timbered seems to show up mostly and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, Alex, seems to show up as, the British describe it sometimes. We Americans tend to use timber framing. Half timbered and timber framing are the ones that I use most often.
So half timber, and it is. And for the podcast visitors, what exactly is half timbering?
Half timbering is timber framing, okay, so, but it's a wooden frame joined together by holes in the timbers, which are called mortises. And on the end of the posts and rails and other pieces, there is a tongue constructed which fits down into that mortise pretty tightly. That forms the joints of all the connections, all the fastening in a timber frame building. I will go back to what you said. Imagine a Tudor style house that they're familiar with.
And now we're going to go to our German house, which comes from the little village of Hurt. It also is a half-timbered house. Is there a connection in the styles of buildings between Germany and England?
Well, their basic construction techniques are the same. As a matter of fact, it's a little easier to interpret timber framing in the German house than it is on the English house. However, and I'm not going to attempt the German words because I'll butcher it. The bracing is one difference. And by a brace, that's what I'm talking about, is a diagonal which is put on a wall, which we'll call a bent, to keep it from racking one way or the other. The English, from what I have seen, almost always will use a diagonal brace which goes from post to plate and form that 90-degree angle. Some of the German timber framing, instead of having that post to plate, they will put, as part of the wall structure, as part of the post, they'll put in diagonally placed posts to strengthen the frame and keep it from racking. So that's one situation. Another thing is, most people are used to timber framing having a sill, which is a bottom plate, into which the posts are attached. If you notice on one side of the house, the older side of the house, it has an interior sill, and the posts come all the way down to the foundation. That's a common German timber framing technique. Now, the addition to the German house right next to it, the Anbau, is put in with a sill placed on the foundation and the post coming in right into it as we're used to. But if you've ever noticed on that part of the house, it has perhaps an older technique of German timber framing there.
Was there any cultural connection with having the half timbering? Was it anything to do with a restriction on wood, which is what a lot of visitors tend to suppose?
You have to remember the environment there too. I think it was less a restriction on wood, as there just wasn't as much wood, to be had. Log cabin building actually, was taking place in Germany, for a while, but that was in places they have plenty of wood. One of the things I like to point out about the German house is that if you look at the framing, if you look at the sills, that two things jump out at you. First of all, the quality of the wood isn't that great that they built with. It has veiny edges, it's crooked, sometimes it doesn't fit in very well. Secondly, there's a number of previously used timbers in there as well. Now, that can come either from its original construction or it could come from when the frame was restored in Germany prior to being shipped here.
And the last thing, and this is same in the English house and the German house, what is in between the timber? There's big gaps. They fill it up with what?
Well, it's called wattle and daub. In between all the panels that are created by the intersection of all the timbers need to be filled in with something. Normally, a post is going to be put in vertically, and then in the case of, I think both the English and the houses traditionally they would weave hazel or willow in and out basket pipe like that, then slap mud on it. That's called the daub, and then it's usually troweled. One of our problems with when we were reconstructing these houses is we were only allowed to work on these like 8 hours a day. Properly placed daub in the walls requires a little bit more work. The recipe that we've used in England consisted of lime, sand, clay, cow manure, and straw. The straw and the cow manure acting as a binder. We use basically the same in the German farm, minus the cow manure. But even with the binders put in place, the shrinking clay can crack. Often it was said that as the cracks began to appear in these panels, but the panels were still plastic, they were still pliable. Take flat sticks and beat those in and shut those cracks up. What we had to do was we put in 2 layers of daub, managed the cracks as best we could, and then we put a slurry coat over it to hide the cracks. So we had to make some field adjustments when we restored these buildings.
Were there any other particular challenges in bringing some of these structures over and reconstructing them?
A couple of the challenges were if you're not there to document the building yourself prior to bringing you over, that creates a few problems. These buildings were well documented when we did get them. We had enough information to put them back together. And we did have, take the English house, for example, we had an English engineering company come over, and they were pretty much responsible for the restoration of the timbers, making the decisions where they went back up. With the German house, 2 German carpenters assisted us. So we did have a little help. Not only do we have the documentation, but in those particular international cases, we had help getting those in.
As opposed to the Haina barn, which I've heard was a little bit more challenging.
Yeah, the Haina barn was a little bit more challenging because the 3 of us could figure it out. But what we did was, the Haina barn came with some other structures that were 20th century structures. We weren't really interested in putting those up. We didn't have any place to put them. But they were all tagged the same way. So we essentially had 3 buildings which were tagged exactly the same way, and we did not have any drawings. No drawings were sent that we were aware of. So we basically had to lay out in a field all 3 of these buildings and decide what will look like.
Now, back to the sites on the museum, let's go on to the Irish house, which is really different than all the other structures that we have. Can you tell us a little bit about the context and the rebuilding of that site?
Okay, well, the Irish house, the context of that was, again, that's a very vernacular house, and often when I'm on the African farm, I'll pull up the Irish house as kind of compare and contrast. That it's built basically from what materials are available on or very close to the site. So the Irish house, in its construction, is called clodding, and that is it's fieldstone. It's laid in it's coursed rubble. It has finished quoins, which are corners. But the clodding, what happens is they'll have a face on the outside, a face on the inside, and then in between the 2, it's filled up with rubble, mortar, whatever. So that just comes, straight up. And the walls are pretty thick, 19, 20 inches. But the stones rarely go all the way through. Stone was a common building material in Ireland. We'll find it just about everywhere. So, and then it was thatched, to be, depending on what part of Ireland you were from, it could be thatched, scallop thatching with either wheat, rye, even flax. The poorest people are going to thatch their houses with rushes and heather sometimes. So that was the construction aspect of it. And then it's a single room. And it'll show up later at the museum. But it's a single room. It has a balanced facade. Any additions that would go into that house were usually added along the long axis, i.e. the ridge line, or it would go up as a second floor. Almost never was another building added, say, to the back of the house. Shared another common wall, and that's a kind of a feature and a characteristic of that type of vernacular building.
Now, the big question a lot of people ask about thatched roof and get a little bit back to thatched roof. And how long do thatched roofs last?
That depends on the materials, depends on the workmanship, and basically it depends on the pitch of the roof. The steeper the pitch of the roof, everything else being in place, the steeper the pitch of the roof, the longer it will last. The roof that was on the house prior to being replaced with the REIT was organically grown rye straw that actually Alex and I picked up in southeast Pennsylvania, Lancaster County, and transported to the site. That lasted 19 years. And so it did fairly well, and of course it was put in by a professional thatcher. Some of the other roofs lasted normally on the average with rye straw, the way we have it, had it up until then, anywhere from 11 to 8 years. The Forge, which had the most shallow pitch, its life was usually about 8 years. Or so the other ones were 11 in the house. You got 20 out of it.
Now, Ray, I've read somewhere, and it seems true, but I'm going to ask you right now, that thatched roofs work better in much damper climates like Ireland.
Intuitively, that seems to be true. When I'm working in the Forge of blackness sometimes, people get nervous about how close the fire in the hearth is to the thatched roof. And they ask, well, do the roofs catch on fire? Then we get into the conversation of, it does rain a lot in Ireland, and the roofs do seem to stay somewhat sodden. So, intuitively, it seems to be that it probably would work better as far as a fire hazard is concerned. Having said that, on the Irish house, in its 19th year, hadn't quite made it to 20, that roof did catch on fire, and we had to replace it. It burned completely down without damaging the rest of the building, I might add. And again, when that roof caught on fire, it was during the driest time of the year. It was a windy day. A ember just got sucked up the chimney. The door was open, just one of those things. Deposited itself on the roof, and given the wind, given the dry conditions, the roof burned off fairly quickly.
Now, we're talking about damp conditions and materials, and that also seems to follow through with what you're talking about with Africa, that they are roofing their houses with raffia palm, brush-type material. But it's also true on our native exhibit, where we do have our wigwams with cattails, either woven or thatched on top of them. So, can you talk a little bit about those structures and how those developed independently of any of the European influences?
I've often said, and I use this as an interpretation quite a bit, is that a universal solution to a universal problem. That human beings are going to solve the same problem the same way without sharing that information. Take the wigwams on our Indian site. It's a frame structure, and I should say a bent pole structure frame. It looks like a half of a geodesic dome almost sticking up out of the ground. We have constructed that early on by taking cattails, flipping them over one bar, slamming them nice tight together, and it made an actually pretty good watertight system, particularly when we put sheets of bark on the very roof on the flat part to turn the rain. It stayed dry in there, and it stayed warm in there, and it made that wigwam comfortable. Actually, the wigwam is probably one of the most comfortable structures that we have here as far as staying in it and staying warm. So they're using a type of thatching as well. The Ebo, again, the thatch roofs that you could have used over there, and this will depend on where they would build, were mats made out of raffia palm, and it was referred to as thatch by the architectural historians who were describing that type of situation. Elephant grass was also a favorite thatching material in southeast Nigeria as well. Again, that tended to be closer to the savanna than it was in the rainforest, but it was certainly being used in that particular area. So, yeah, you have a thatched roof in West Africa. You have thatched roofs in Western Europe. You have thatched roofs in Eastern North America, and we know that there's thatched roofs being used all throughout pre-Columbian North America and South America. Thatch kind of survived up until about the turn of the 19th century. In the valley and other rural areas, many of the outbuildings on farms and other dependencies were thatched.
So going back to your term vernacular architecture, it really is completely dependent on what is available locally for your natural resources, but people will utilize them.
Oh yes, they will utilize it, and you might take the Irish, for example, when they're growing their rye crop. They're thinking rye seed. They're probably growing just as well for for roofing material, too. And the same thing could be held true for, I guess we'll get into a little bit later, spreading shingles out of a wall.
Especially talking about the wigwam, a lot of these structures are made out of very sensitive materials that don't survive in the archaeological record. How do we know what these wigwams look like? How did we reconstruct that site?
We rely heavily on the archaeological footprint of these buildings, and this is what we know. We know that certain buildings were built during certain times, particularly in areas that have been inhabited for long periods of time. So that gives us the footprints of it. Also, we rely heavily on some of the first observations of native architecture by Europeans, which is my professional opinion that we have to be kind of careful with sometimes when we look at it. But it gives us an example of what to at least attempt when we reconstruct some of these buildings. And then there's also simply experimental archaeology to see what works. We have lots of descriptions from early European observers, which are very, very helpful and based with archaeology, and then us actually attempting to do it, I think gives us a pretty good picture of how these buildings are built.
So the question I have, we have 2 wigwams on our site, and we are planning on building more. How big were these eastern woodland settlements?
I think the ones that we have, and I can't give you the exact numbers, were based on some local archaeology that we had. The diameters seemed of these things, we're going to pretend they're all circular for the sake of this argument, but the diameter seemed to vary in different, perhaps they're holding more people. One of the things that's important to point out, I think, the wigwams themselves were housing for a single family, perhaps, or a single.
And the key thing on this is these are structures you cannot move, right?
Yeah, you cannot move them. It's actually, when you get right down to it, since they're in the ground, it's more or less permanent architecture. If they stay there for any length of time and attempt to move them, I think would be kind of hard. So this doesn't, in my estimation, doesn't suggest any sort of nomadic situation. Back to vernacular architecture, they're being built in an area where no matter where people move to, these materials are readily available to them right then and there. And I kind of have an idea that these folks would site their living conditions based on what was readily available.
So occasionally we do talk about that site being peripatetic, where as the soil exhausts, they will pack up and move. But that doesn't mean they're moving the village itself. They could probably take some of the cattail mats. They could probably take maybe some of the bark if they had it. But for the most part, they're just going to leave these structures behind, is what you're saying, because they're just ready to go back to the earth.
Yeah, I think so. And they have, and one of the things that we're doing right now is these things they do have a life. They do have a life based on what they're constructed of and how they were constructed. So I don't think that people are pulling up the poles and moving long bent poles through probably forested terrain to get to the next site. I doubt that. I think it's there already. They'll just utilize their knowledge to build these type of structures.
And the last thing I want to mention on this, which most people don't realize it when they see these wigwams, they are exceptionally warm in cold weather. They are much warmer than rectangular buildings.
They are. I can't give you the physics as to why that is, but for one thing, unlike some of our cabins, the fire is located right in the center of the wigwam itself. There is a smoke hole right above it, which will relieve the smoke in there, and since it is kind of conical, this is sort of channel the smoke all the way up to the top.
So that's a key point we like to make to our visitors, that these wigwams are very comfortable and would be very comfortable to live in.
Yes.
now, our settlement site, 1760s, in the Valley of Virginia, was built to reflect what the recently arrived immigrants would be building, which is basically a rectangular log structure. None of the groups we've talked about so far, including those from where these immigrants are actually coming from, built like this. So where did this style come from?
I read somewhere that E. Eston Evans, the Irish folklorist in the mid-20th century, he made the point that along the western Atlantic, down the Atlantic coast, from Scandinavia to sub-Saharan Africa, the most common house plan was the rectangular gable building. So it's been around for a long, long time. I read that a long, long time ago that he said that, and actually, our collection of vernacular architecture here, to a degree, backs that up a little bit. And particularly, we'll take our Irish house, for example. I've already talked about how it's rectangular in shape. It's added onto along the long axis of the ridge. As far as that, the early cabins that we read about being built in the backcountry, by some of the first settlers coming in, tend to be about the same size as we have. That would vary. They weren't large. Some were more square than others. But the key thing is here they're constructed of logs. And unlike timber-poor Western Europe, there were trees galore that confronted these immigrants as they made their way into the backcountry. So they, just like their Irish and West African and Western European forebears, utilized the materials that they had right at hand to build this. The rectangles seem to be the most common form.
I've read somewhere that the Swedish colony in Delaware, along the Delaware River, they tended to build in the woods of Sweden and in going into Finland in log cabins, and that they're the ones who taught the English and the Germans and the Irish how to build out of log. Is there any truth to this?
Well, the Swedes are given credit for bringing the log cabin to North America, but according to some architectural historians, the Germans, too, also had the same, depending on where they were from, also were familiar with log cabin building. And the Irish were not. They were used to building out of stone. One could say this is that we've taken perhaps the Anglo-Irish plan that we have here at the museum, which is a rectangular house in the end chimney, and then took the other West African traditions, and that's kind of a mix of a single floor plan with a different technology, building technology. We could sit around and talk about that all day, actually.
And this leads to another question I have. Did the first Irish who come over, did they try to build out of stone, or did they soon realize, wait a minute, why are we building out of stone when there are all these trees we have to clear for our fields?
Well, it depends on where you're talking about. We do know that in the northern valley, the Peckham settlement, many of those buildings were built out of stone. And that was a kind of a Scotch-Irish enclave and a otherwise Germanic population, but they were building with stone as well. And it depends on whatever resources I believe were available to them. If you have plenty of logs and you have to get a structure up very quickly, like the one we have behind ourselves right here, then they're going to build with walls. I'm thinking almost immediately. You did tend to find much more permanent architecture a little bit later on, built out of stone in the valley. Stanton had a lot of stone buildings early on, as did Harrisonburg, right here in the valley. That was permanent stone architecture, but again, on a very vernacular sense, once land was being settled, the most available resource would be.
We built it right on the ground, no foundation or anything along those lines. Basically, we always say this is, like we joke, the ultimate starter house. This was just to get you started until you could build something better. Am I interpreting that correctly or not?
I mean, I think you are to a degree. One of the things that our research has shown is these buildings were built just like we have. They might build them on the ground. They were probably a little bit more selective as to what species they laid down for sills, be it locust or white oak or something like that. That would be a little bit more weather resistant. But things that we know is that when some of these folks build log cabins, their circumstance was such that they were never able to get out of them, never able to build anything much better. And on the other hand, a lot of folks did use this as you said, a starter house, temporary architecture that they would live in while they built something better. There are descriptions of building rather elaborate log houses in the middle of the 18th century here in the valley, which included 2 stories and pent roofs, along the first story there, which is pretty interesting.
And the last question, were these settlements in the valley, were they haphazard and placed wherever in the landscape, or was there some strategic planning involved in these settlements?
The strategic planning, as far as I was concerned, getting a plot of land. Your plan, if you're an early settler in there, you're going into a place that you know that you will eventually have clear title to your land. The first folks there, you're looking for water availability, you're looking for good bottom land for farming, and enough land to provide for other aspects of the farm.
So basically, water was probably...
I think water was most important, followed very closely by fertile farmland.
And the one thing I want to add about our museum, where we have our farms located, there is no water source. They would not pick the locations we have picked for them.
All right, so moving on to the house that is just after this so-called starter kit, 1820s is kind of a snapshot of the blending of styles in the valley architecturally. So you discussed kind of the architectural mishmash going on in that house and how it's kind of showing this movement towards an American style of building.
So our 1820s house was built in 2 phases. The first phase was built in 1773 by a Germanic immigrant named George Bowman, who first settled in southeast Pennsylvania, making his way into the Shenandoah Valley, and beginning construction on that building in around 1773. It's known as Vernacular House. There's a lot of examples of this type of building in southeast Pennsylvania. And for any visitors or anyone listening to the podcast here who've been in our German farmhouse, 1773 part of our 1820s house kind of mimics the same floor plan, the same use of space. So the original builder built his own vernacular footprint when he gets into the Shenandoah Valley. When the grandson inherited the property and President addition onto the house, he made no effort really to honor his grandfather's Germanic building techniques. He was adding on what was common and becoming popular in the area, and that was a passage with a full width of the house room on one end of it. It's beginning to mimic something we call an I-house, which is a central passage house with balanced floor plan there with a balanced facade. The old part of the house, the 1773 part, does not have an exterior facade, but once he adds the door and the windows, go back and look at it, you can see that I believe there's a constant balanced facade of the entire building itself right there in a certain fashion. So he also uses different building techniques. He's abandoned the full dovetail notching on the wall, 1773 log house, and is going for the more ubiquitous V-notching.
Is that because V-notching is easier than dovetail notching?
I believe it is. V-notching is easier than dovetail notching. I've done both. So I would go along with that. It was just simple. It required less skill.
And the last question I have on the 1820s farmhouse, it has 2 porches, one on the back and one on the front of the house. In fact, I would say that is the best part of the house because sitting on that porch on a breezy day is very comfortable. What is the history of porches on American houses?
There are a lot of theories out there. Some archaeologists like to attribute the front porch or the porches as being a particularly African situation. However, you can find porches in ancient Greek vernacular architecture. Temple architecture reflects a porch, so porches have been around for a long time. But there's no doubt in my mind that some of the architectural influences in the valley included spaces in African architecture, porch, some of these as well. Early descriptions of Shenandoah Valley architecture, particularly with the Futukan house that we states that these buildings had a piazza, as it was called. That was the description for a porch. Porch is actually an earlier English term, which is usually an enclosed appendage, on a house as well. So that's kind of come into our vernacular nomenclature now, porch, but it's probably more apt to say than piazza. So I think the porch was actually one of those, as I said before, that was a universal solution to a universal problem and cannot be laid squarely at the feet of any particular group of people.
All right, and now we're going to go to our 1850s farmhouse, and this seems to embody the final development of log houses. Can you talk a little bit about the switch from log to balloon frame structures?
All right. The plan of the earliest part of the house, the direct entry hall plan, with the room right above it, I believe that was the most ubiquitous plan. Log construction lent itself to that type of construction. Balloon framing, as we know it, was a response to basically improved technology. One is right around 1800. Development of a nail-making machine, so you can make square machine nails in mass by the thousands, where before that they had to be hand-forged individually. Secondly, I think the advent of steam power and steam sawmills at about the middle of the 19th century too meant that lumber could be sawn rapidly and accurately and uniformly. So that in itself kind of gave rise to balloon framing. Now, balloon framing is basically, let's say, 2x4 construction or 2x something construction with a plate post that the studs might go up further than 2 stories. Second floors and attics and stuff were kind of nailed onto those. It has since evolved into what we call platform framing, where put up the same type of frame that I talked about, then build a floor on top of that, then build a second story on top of the floor on top of that, and so on and so forth. So the rise of balloon structures was basically derived from technological advances in hardware and lumber processing.
And this you could pretty much say is the end of vernacular architecture in the U.S.?
I wouldn't say that, personally. Vernacular architecture tends to morph. You certainly can't put it into any kind of box. One of the things that I like to point out about, let's take our own 1850s house. It's made out of logs. It's square. It has a very simple floor plan. Yet the little surround, the mantle there, is a very simple Greek revival mantle, which means that these folks who are building things still in a vernacular sense are pulling in other ideas, and that's something about vernacular architecture as well, is groups of people can pull in other ideas, from others. One of the things that we were, when we were in Nigeria, what we were looking at, we had to be very careful that we were looking at architecture there that didn't have a colonial influence, some that we would just take as being vernacular. The fact that it may have had some colonial influence, did that make it less vernacular? I don't think so. It's still vernacular.
All right, Ray. Well, we have one last question for you. Of all the buildings you've restored, which is your favorite?
Oh man, they're kind of like my kids. They each come with their own different set of joys and frustrations. My favorite, well, it's really hard to say. I really enjoyed the 1820s putting that together, and because I was involved in every aspect of it. So that was pretty much my favorite. African Farm is a very, very, very close second.
All I can know is I helped Ray take down the 1820s farmhouse and put it up, and that was some of the more enjoyable times I've ever had at the museum. It was a lot of fun and a lot of hard work.
It was.
So thank you, Ray, for that walk through the architecture of the the museum and how these structures actually develop. You can be sure to catch Ray on many of the sites of the museum if you're interested in learning more about historic architecture preservation. So we hope you enjoyed Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds. We bring you historical episodes twice a month. You can check out the Frontier Culture Museum online at frontiermuseum.org, on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. You'll find background on all the farms of the museum, information on upcoming events, and so much more.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, please consider visiting the website and clicking the donate button. Donations to the American Frontier Culture Foundation support programs like field trips, summer camps, and special events. We greatly appreciate it. See you next time.